Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our first plenary session of our 2021 Church History online conference, the first one of its kind, of course, because of the pandemic. But hopefully this won't be the last time we do something online. I'm Anthea Butler. I am the incoming president for the American Society of Church History. It's my pleasure tonight to welcome you here for this first panel that I came up with because I think a lot of us are thinking about public scholarship these days and how to do that and what that means and how you can be a part of it. And so this plenary panel, History and Public Scholarship, Church History for the Masses, is a way for us to think about and to talk to people who actually do public scholarship in certain kinds of ways, whether they're a documentarian or a museum curator. And so it's my pleasure tonight to introduce three people to you we will be having a discussion tonight with, and we'll see some of their work. And hopefully that will give us some different ways to think about public scholarship and how we can be involved in that, first of all, and then secondarily, how to get our students and others to appreciate the scholarship that goes behind public scholarship. All right, so tonight it's my pleasure to introduce three people who I've had the pleasure of working with in various different kinds of ways, and whose work I admire very much. And so I want to start off first with Sarah Colt, who is going to unmute herself and show herself to you now in the big reveal, hopefully. Hi, Sarah. Sarah Colt is a New York-based documentary filmmaker whose work brings to life the figures and forces that have shaped America. A graduate of Harvard University, Sarah began her career as a still photographer. As a Radcliffe Traveling Fellow, she spent a year photographing and living in Zimbabwe. Since founding Sarah Colt Productions over a decade ago, she has directed and produced for PBS award-winning series American Experience, including the Emmy-nominated Walt Disney, Henry Ford, The Polio Crusade, and Part 4 of We Shall Remain, a mini-series on Native history. Her film, The Gilded Age, told the story of one of the most transformative eras in American history and its unsettling parallels with the present day. In 2015, she was praised by The Hollywood Reporter for her impressive work chronicling the 20th century's most brilliant, most creative, most egotistical industrialists. If this resembles anybody else's description, please don't hold it against her. She's also been part of the show that many of you will know, God in America, which is where we got to know each other, which aired on PBS, and the forthcoming American Experience on Billy Graham, which airs in May 2021. Thanks for joining us tonight, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Next, we have Veronica Stickelman. Reveal yourself, Veronica. Hi, Veronica Stickelman is a Philadelphia-based producer and director. Her work can be seen on CNN, PBS, ESPN, and Oxygen. Her portfolio of work reflects an interdisciplinary approach to media with emphasis on academic research, critical thinking, as well as thought leadership in historical and contemporary storytelling. Stickelman has her Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology, Sociology, and Anthropology from Drexel University, and her Master's of Arts in Broadcasting, Telecommunications, and Mass Media program from Temple University. She is truly a Philadelphia young woman. And then finally, and most importantly, she had a series that we're going to be showing a little clip from tonight, The Pope, which was on CNN. Was it 2018, right? And then also the forthcoming series, Lincoln, which starts on CNN on February the 14th, which I'm sure lots of us will be interested in. And so those of you who have history buffs in your families, please get them to watch. All right. And then finally, last but not least, Peter Manseau. Please reveal yourself. Hi. Peter Manseau is the Lilly Endowment Curator of American Religion at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History. His most recent book is The Jefferson Bible, a bibliography. Now, this may make a few of you very nervous. Please don't be nervous. He just happens to be a prolific writer, and he is the author of 10 books, including the memoir Vows, the novel Songs for the Butcher's Daughter, the travel log Rag and Bone, a retelling of America's diverse spiritual formation, One Nation Under God, and the narrative history, The Apparitionists. Winner of the National Jewish Book Award, the American Libraries Association Brody Medal for Outstanding Achievement in Jewish Literature, the Ribble Prize for Fiction, and the 2012 National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship. He's been shortlisted for the Center's Fiction's First Novel Prize, awarded to the best foreign novel published in France. And he also is working on a book right now that I'm very interested in that's going to be about the Tewksbury Asylum, which you got an NEH for, that's correct, right? Yes, right. I wanted to make sure I remembered this. And hopefully we'll be seeing that shortly. But like most of us, the pandemic cuts you down from the kind of research that you need to do on site and archives. So there you go. But you can pick up the Jefferson Bible right now. So I want to talk about how we're going to do tonight, because I want to show a little bit of each one of these great people's work in terms of thinking about public scholarship. And so what I'm going to do is take about 5 to 7 minutes with each one of them to show you a little clip of something that they've done, to discuss it with them, and then I'll bring everybody back together again so that I can ask them a few questions, and then you can put your Q&A in the chat. If you have questions and answers, there's a Q&A section, and I'd like you to put your questions there because I may miss something if you put it in the chat, okay? So I want to start off first with Veronica, because we're going to go in order about how this looks chronologically. And I will be showing you a little clip that comes from the Pope series that was shown 2 years ago. And this speaks a lot about scholarship and how you do it and what happens with it. So bear with me for a minute while I get this up and ready to show to you. And here we go.
Deep within the private library of the Greek patriarch in Jerusalem lives the 2,000-year-old document that outlines the first cohesive guidelines of Christianity. It's called the Didache.
This document actually presents the formation of the church in its primitive state.
This sacred text was lost until 1883, when a Greek translation from the 11th century was found. Out of fear of theft or desecration, it has never before been seen on camera until now.
You don't have a Bible back then. How do you transmit the faith? How do you tell them how to behave? How do you tell them what to do in a service? The Didache does all of that for you.
But outlining the rules is only the first step. Christians also need an infrastructure to enforce those behaviors.
And of course, it wants to keep showing.
Deep within the private library of the Greek patriarch in Jerusalem lives the 2,000-year-old
I knew I would mess up
document
something.
that outlines the first cohesive guidelines of Christianity. It's
You needed to see the Didache twice, because that I'd be always messing up how to pronounce it. There we go. All right, cool. So Veronica, tell us a little bit about how you had to do that clip for the Pope and why that was important to show that one particular book that right now that I'm totally mispronouncing.
You know, it took a while for us to pronounce it properly as well. So when we started the series it was a 6-part series on the history of the papacy, and you can't really tell the history of the papacy without talking about how a pope came to be. And so we went all the way back. And for us to describe how these formalities were formed, in doing our kind of producer research, really truncated wild literature review, this book kept coming up. But it was a mystery how to find it. And I'll say network television loves the words never before seen artifact. It is the best marketing tool they have. So in the chase for this, it was definitely something everybody wanted. We found a couple different instances where it was referenced and that it existed. We chased those cross references and talked to scholars who were working on those things, and eventually found it was at the Greek patriarchs in Jerusalem. We were already going to Jerusalem, so then it's about the process of, okay, working with archives, you can't always light them, you can't always get close to them, you can't always touch them. We all know that. And so it was like, what access are we going to get? We have no idea. And it was a process to understand how to formally communicate with the Greek patriarch, to understand what we could and couldn't do, what questions we might ask that would completely shut us down. And it worked better than we expected or could have imagined, as
Yeah.
you saw.
How long did it take you to shoot the series? I'm just curious. I know that I worked with you on part of it when you were filming here in Philadelphia, and we can talk about where you had to film so that you could recreate something in a minute. But I'm
Yeah.
curious about how long does it take to think about doing something like this, and when do you start the research?
Oh, so the people who originally started to develop this process, they were doing it for about a year before I came into the pre-production stage. But unfortunately, in these things, when you have sometimes when you have development producers doing something, they like really juicy things that aren't real. And so it's our duty to then really research and say, well, this is really the story. One of the things they wanted to say was, Michelangelo came up with this term. I don't remember what it was now, but basically they want to say these kind of kitschy things in the pitch, and then we have to kind of make it real. So I probably read a lot of very long, dense books in a month and a half.
Yeah.
So it's not a lot of time in TV world to make sure that you're getting like the baseline of scholarship language to then have any sense of how to talk to people who've dedicated their lives to it, to the topic.
Yeah, exactly.
And so long story short, the process of this took about, I would say, 2.5 years is from here's an idea to it's going to air.
Okay. And so, I asked you about where we shot at here in Philadelphia. And so think about, location shoots. I mean, you were in Jerusalem, you were here in Philadelphia, you need to make Philadelphia look like it was Italy. And you might remember where we were. I sort of remember where we were, but I don't remember. All I remember about that day was really hot.
It was really hot that day. We, so that, I believe that was Elkins Estate.
Yes.
Which was at the time, it's not anymore. I want to say it was a convent.
It was a convent. That's right.
Yeah.
It was a convent. That part I remember. It was a convent. It was a pretty
So
swank
they
convent.
built it.
Yeah, exactly.
So, fortunately for the series, we were able to go to Jerusalem and go to Italy, and go to a few places, but budgetarily and timeline, you can't go everywhere. Originally we were talking about, well, we should do some recreations in Rome because Philadelphia is not Rome.
Mhm.
It's an old city, but it's not that
It's
old.
not that old.
So we actually got to a point where we did all 6 episodes recreations in Philadelphia.
Okay.
And some people might be familiar. It's a pretty significant place, Girard College.
Yes.
That was, Constantine's Rome. So
That's pretty great.
A lot of really, camera tricks, lighting tricks, prop tricks, and we were able to, make a lot of places look
Yeah.
good.
Look old, right?
Old.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say it's like Constantine Jerome around Girard College, but maybe not at the college. But yeah, it's a little hairy. But thank you. I'm going to come back to you later when I bring you all back together, and we can talk some more about how you get scholars involved in all of that. So thank you.
Yep, no problem.
Peter, we are going to show something from the Smithsonian Museum before I start to talk to Peter. And I want to preface this by saying I want to thank anybody who is an LDS person here, because you always have the greatest clips on earth, and this worked out really well for us. And I'm very grateful because it means that we can show something. And I want to show the first, basically what this is religion in America. And this is the first in early America, let me say that. And this is the first thing from, stop. This is the first, am I correct? Your first thing you did at Smithsonian?
This is my first exhibit at the National Museum of American History. It is up,
Okay.
Religion in Early America is up from 2017 to 2018.
Okay, great. And I want to get this back to the beginning. So hold on one second. And I will show a clip and then we'll talk about it. And hopefully the share screen will act right this time. Okay, here we go.
Several Mormon artifacts from early church history are on display at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. Most items are on loan from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to the museum's new Religion in America exhibit. The exhibit covers 200 years of early American beliefs and practices. On display is an 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon and a page from the original manuscript. Scribes wrote on this page as Joseph Smith, the first prophet of the Mormon Church, dictated the translation to them. Only 28% of the original manuscript has survived. Brendan Metcalf hand-delivered the items to the museum.
Of all things, we often get asked, what is our most important record that we have here, most valuable? And to me, it's the original manuscript.
This is the first time the church has loaned out a piece of the manuscript.
People have always had to come to Salt Lake City to see any of the pages from the original manuscript. When the church was willing to loan us this for this exhibit, we knew it was a significant opportunity to show something that had never been shown here before, and that many would recognize this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see this here in Washington.
The Book of Mormon was one of 5,000 copies printed in Palmyra, New York. There are only an estimated 700 to 800 copies that exist. The church also loaned 2 banknotes from the Kirkland Safety Society.
I think it's wonderful to have some of our real premier documents on display for others to see and others to come to understand what our church is all about.
The exhibit also includes 2 extremely rare Mormon gold coins created shortly after the pioneers arrived in the Salt Lake Valley in the late 1840s. Other rare items on display include George Washington's christening gown from 1732 and the Bible used at his inauguration. Visitors can also see the Jefferson Bible. Thomas Jefferson cut and pasted verses from the New Testament for his own scripture reading and study.
This story could not have been told without the involvement of many religious communities from all over the United States. And without exception, every community we approached wanted their story told. They wanted to show that their church, their religious identity was part of American religious history from the very beginning.
Okay, so I want to ask the first question is, how did you ever become the Smithsonian Curator for American Religion in the first place?
Well, interestingly, the National Museum of American History's journey with religion actually owes a lot to the PBS series God in America. At the time that God in America was released, many of my future colleagues, as I was still several years away from the museum, watched that show and thought, you know, it's interesting that we don't have someone focused on religion. So at that time, they brought in a scholar of religion that many people will know from Boston University named Stephen Prothero. And Dr. Prothero began to talk with them about what it would look like to have a curatorial position devoted to religion. At that point, I joined the museum as a fellow, and together with Steve Prothero, we began to write a white paper, essentially trying to suggest the ways in which the museum could engage with religion. So it was beginning through that conversation, but it was quite a long process involving a number of public symposia, inviting scholars from all over the country to talk about what it would mean to talk about religion at a National History Museum, and really building organically from there. It was all told about an 8-year process of conversation to work towards having the creation of my position, which is the first curator of American religious history.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I'm also wondering, this first exhibit that you did, which I got the chance to see, which was really fantastic. Some people are going to say, well, why did we show this clip about Mormons? And I think it's really important for a couple of reasons. One is the church made this great video. So I'm very grateful for that, because it made it easy for me to be able to show people what your whole exhibit looked like. But I think it also really speaks to how you have to partner with churches and different kinds of religious groups. And I know that room had a lot of different things in there. So a two-part question. One is, how long did it take you to bring everything together? And what was the most difficult thing to get in that room?
Well, the exhibit really began with the availability of the Bay Psalm book. So the Bay Psalm book, one of only a very few number of copies of it that exist, in addition of the Psalms translated and printed in Puritan Boston, was made available for display at the museum. And that really suggested that if we were going to show that, what sort of exhibit should it be part of? And we decided it should be an exhibit on religion in early America generally. And with such a singular object as that, we thought this is our opportunity to group together a number of really singular objects. So it was with that in mind, and knowing also that we were able to show from our own collections the so-called Jefferson Bible, the Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, which Jefferson created with a penknife and glue at Monticello in 1820. With those really marquee objects in mind, we did approach the LDS Church, let them know of this opportunity to include Mormon history within this broad portrait of religion in early America. And we were very fortunate that they were happy to do so. And in an ongoing way, we were so fortunate that so much LDS media came to see this once in a lifetime event of seeing the manuscript page from the Book of Mormon displayed in Washington, that in addition to that clip, there are several other Mormon affiliated media clips that we had from that exhibit. So there was quite a lot of excitement around that object and all the objects that were around it.
Yeah, that's great. The other question I was going to have for you, and this relates to the last thing we did see, the Jefferson Bible, is you've had this interesting kind of role, because not only do you put together things for curation, but you also have written some things that are, how do I want to say, have a purchase to the museum. In other words, they highlight some of the things that have happened in the museum, but you also do programming. So talk a little bit about that and this public piece of the work that you do.
Sure. Well, most recently, I did publish this book about the Jefferson Bible biography, which is part of Princeton University Press's great series, The Lives of Great Religious Books. And that arose because I was, as I travel around the country talking about my work, I happened to be at a conference where I talked about the Jefferson Bible, and I learned of that series, and it seemed like it would be a great fit. So it was one way of being able to bring stories from the museum outside the museum walls to meet the visitors where they are who may not be able to visit the exhibits at the museum. And the other way we try to approach meeting visitors where they are is by assuming that not everyone is going to want to go into an exhibit called Religion in Early America and read 50 captions and spend a lot of time thinking about objects. And so within the museum space, we also do a lot of programming. We do a concert series called Sounds of Faith, which presents American religious history through American musical history. We also have an ongoing theater series that, both through stage plays and interactive theater performances, engages visitors, mainly school groups, in American religious history. So for example, most recently, before the pandemic, we launched a new program about the ring shout. It's called Shout, and it engages school groups in learning about the ring shout tradition, which is of course an early musical and religious tradition among the African-American community. And the way we connected it to the lives of students today was showing the ways in which this musical tradition can be heard in some contemporary music. So suggesting that knowledge does not only transfer via books or via things that we can study in that way, it transfers through culture and it moves across time in that way. And to find ways to let student groups experience that through sound and music, and especially movement, to move in a ring in the Grand Hall of the National Museum of American History and learn.
Oh no, what happened? What happened? What happened? No way. No way.
Religious history. Actually a very compelling history, and it speaks to their personal experiences. That's what we've been trying to do.
Great. And then one final question, because I know that you just got a very big grant, and I want to ask you to talk about what that's going to do for the museum, just briefly.
Sure. So my work for the past 5 years has been leading something that we've called the Religion in America initiative, which has been both producing exhibits like Religion in Early America and our next exhibit on intersections of religion, science, and technology in American history, as well as doing some of that programming that I mentioned. And now that that 5-year initiative is ending, we have gone back to our original sponsors, our collaborators at the Lilly Endowment, and through a major gift, we are establishing the Center for the Understanding of Religion in American History. And this is going to be both an academic center, bringing in scholars for regular conversation and for translating their work for the public. It will can continue to offer the types of programming we've had. And most importantly, it will have a 20-year gallery devoted to the exploration of religion in American history, as broadly conceived as we can make it.
That's great. So we just got to hope for the end of the pandemic so we all can come back and see it, right?
That's right.
Thank
One
you.
day.
All right, Sarah, last but very much not least. Hi.
Hi.
Sarah and I'm going to, full disclosure, have been working on a little something that I'm about to show all of you with one of the men that vexes me very much in life for a variety of reasons. I love him and I have a love-hate relationship with this man. And I'm just going to play this and then we're going to talk, okay? And let me preface it by saying that this is the forthcoming special that will be on America Experience May, right? May 2021.
May, and I just have to say that this is a work in progress. So people are getting a sneak peek of something that's still in process.
That's right. You are getting a preview here. You will see it first. And I'm very excited to show this to you. So let me get this up for you. And that's not what we want to see. And let me make sure that everything else gets dumped out of here so that you see what you're supposed to see. Okay, hold on one second. Okay.
I remember standing in Madison Square Garden. I stood there looking at that cavernous stadium the day before it all started and looking up at those empty seats and saying, what is this going to be like? It was a contract to start with for 3 or 4 weeks that could be extended. It was extended a week and another week and another week. Went on 16 and a half weeks and was full every night.
Coming from a small town in Missouri, I had never seen that many people in one place. Madison Square Garden seated 18,000. I remember the lines of people outside trying to get in. It was a lot like a sporting event.
Tonight, we're delighted to have from Montgomery, Alabama, Dr. Martin Luther King, the minister of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church.
Billy Graham invites this young up-and-coming minister, Martin Luther King Jr., to be part of the program as a way of reaching across racial and ethnic lines.
Heavenly Father, we thank thee this evening for the marvelous things which have been done in this city through the dynamic preaching of this great evangelist. We ask thee, O God, to continue blessing him, give him continued power and authority.
He knows, to his credit, that this tall, white, blue-eyed preacher is not going to bring in Black people or Latinos and Latinas. He needs other folks to help bridge that gap.
He's also making a statement about civil rights in the Southern region. He's trying to expand his audience to include people of color, saying that you are actually welcome as part of this campaign.
I love that you picked this particular clip because we've had lots of conversations about Billy Graham. And I want to ask you, how's it been to work on somebody who is such a, I want to say, a towering figure in one way, but a complicated figure on the other? How do you work with that and talk about the history?
I mean, it's the greatest challenge of a project like this, which is, you know, trying to know somebody who's so famous and so known and yet isn't known, you know, that sort of in terms of who he is as a person. And I do really love biography for that reason, which is just really trying to understand somebody and what makes them tick. But it's definitely a challenge. And I think Billy Graham is a particular challenge. And I have to say, I'm still a little bit, you know, working it out. I mean, we're figuring it out. I hope we're getting closer, and I'm excited to share the film. You know, it feels like the deadline is upon us pretty quickly. You know, the pandemic has made everything, I think, complicated, and making a film in the middle of the pandemic has been hard.
Yeah, I wanted to say that she basically shot me in May after I had been sick, and essentially in a house, and you promised me it was all COVID safe, everything was wonderful. And she went to great lengths. So I just want to say thank you publicly, because you can do this in a pandemic, you just have to do it right? But it takes a lot of working out. I want to back up for a second and ask you this question that's a bit more broad. You've had this kind of long career about documentaries, but what I notice is you keep coming back to religion. And what is it about religious topics that are a source of creativity for you? What is there in terms of thinking about the research that really makes you say, this is the thing I want to do?
Well, it's, you know, I've been very lucky in my career to have the opportunity to work really closely with American Experience, you know, WGBH's history series. And, you know, I have been oftentimes assigned topics, you know, commissioned to make films. And so the series God in America was one that I was asked to work on. And I felt, you know, similarly to when I worked on a series about the brain, I felt it was a neuroscience series. I felt a bit in over my head. You know, I really had a very steep learning curve on God in America, and but learned a tremendous amount. And I have to say that the sort of the collaboration and the relationship that I have with people like you, Anthea, you know, as advisors, people that you can pick up the phone and say, this is what I think it is. Am I even on the right track? Like, what do you know, how do you help me? You know, I rely so much on those relationships, and it is a kind of an ongoing, unfolding relationship with advisors. As you know, at the beginning, I know really nothing, and then I sort of learn more and more and rely on those scholars to help me and guide me. So
Yeah.
I think I hope that answers that question.
No, it does. I think because what would be helpful for everybody to know is, you know, in that relationship, you're not just doing research and all of that, it's coming up with scripts and looking at things, fact checking. Let's talk about fact checking for a minute, because I think that's a really important kind of element in this work, because what you don't want are those notes coming from, you know, some academic who's, you know, annoyed on the sofa going, that's not right, you know. And so talk a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, fact checking is crucial. And I have to say that we not only rely on our advisors to watch the final version and call anything out, but we also always hire an outside person who is usually a graduate student or a journalist, somebody that, you know, can read books quickly. And we have a very, very rigorous thing that we do where we put together a fact check for the script, where we have secondary sources. We have to have 2 or 3 secondary sources or a primary source to prove whatever we're saying. So we work really hard to make sure that we get things right. And even then, I'm sure we always make some sort of mistake.
That's okay. I mean, you know, I think it happens to everybody, but the question is how do people take it, right? And so I want to ask you one more, like, really very specific question about doing Billy Graham, because I think, you know, Billy Graham is sort of this ubiquitous, larger than life American figure, American religious figure, but also a political figure. And how do you go through the tensions? I mean, you just showed us a clip of not Billy Graham, but of Martin Luther King preaching at the New York Crusade, you know, praying at the New York Crusade. And I'm thinking about how that fits into the story about, you know, Graham and King, and how, you know, there's this sort of tension there, and there's a, you know, there's kind of a rift, right? And all of these things happen, but I'm wondering, how do you deal with the tensions about stories that, and it doesn't necessarily have to be Graham either, stories that are complicated, stories that have, you know, these kinds of things where people are going to go, oh, but this person was like this, right? How do you balance that out? How do you balance it out on screen?
Well, I think that the thing that I've tried to do, and I learned this, I made a 4-hour biography of Walt Disney, and the advice that I was given by one of Disney's biographers, a very, you know, great writer named Neil Gabler. And he said to me at the beginning of the project, he said, you will know you're successful if all the people who love Disney are angry about the film and all the people who hate Disney are angry about the film. And so I think that's sort of, I mean, that's an exact, I mean, Disney is particularly polarizing figure, and I don't think Graham maybe has quite that same, but there is that feeling of like, if you knew him really well, you might be angry something is left out, or, you know, so it is it's a response, it's a big responsibility. I mean, to do these films, and I just work really hard to try to, as I say, get to know the person. And one more example from the Disney project, I ended up reading actually, sorry, this is about I did a biography of Henry Ford, and I really struggled to get to know Henry Ford. He was very hard to get to know. And so I actually read the Steve Jobs biography by Walter Isaacson, and that helped me to understand Henry Ford. So there's sort of all these ways that you're trying to get to know the person, and then be fair in how you present them. And it's a challenge.
Great. Let me ask you a final question before I bring everybody back together. How long working on, you know, not counting all the work that you're going to be doing up until May, right, on Billy Graham? When did you start Billy Graham? And I know that's has a little bit of a history to it, but when did you start?
Yeah, so I started working formally and officially on Billy Graham in the fall of 2019. And but there was a writer, you know, similar to Veronica, there was a writer who had been working closely with American Experience and had put together a big development script that we kind of then took over. So I would say this project is several years in the making.
Yeah, and I want people to hear that, because I think one of the things is that you sit down to watch a 2-hour special or a 6-part series or whatever it is, and you think, oh, this is really great. How long did it take? But it takes years to do these things. It's just like a book. It's not a book though. It's something that's visual, or it's a, you know, it's a curation, and you bring all these things back together, and it takes time to do the things that you enjoy for a couple of hours and either walk away from, or decide, like I do sometimes, this is going to be great for my class. I should use this in my class, or I should show this to somebody, or I should share it with someone. So I think the work that you all do is really important. So if I could ask Veronica and Peter to come back, what I want to do, folks, is spend just a little time having them together in a group. And then if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section so that we can pick them up at the end. And so I want to ask a couple of questions, and everybody just jump in when you want to. I think the first question I would ask is, how can historians be helpful for the work that you do in helping to bring the stuff to the public? And any one of you can start.
I'll start. Just one of the things that is, you know, when we're looking at a topic and we're kind of like looking at the body of work around that individual or the topic in general, you know, there's the kind of things that pop out at you, you know, like Harold Holzer, Lincoln, boom, it comes, you know, you can't avoid it. But, you know, I think for us, the challenge is who else is there? Who's the one that's coming up with the new spin on this person or this topic that isn't the same thing everybody's already heard? You know, Sarah said something interesting. It's, you have these familiar topics, you have this familiar person everybody knows, and they want to have a perception of them. But very easily, there's a ton of information that no one has any idea happened. And so, you know, for us to be led to other people, and you helped me with Lincoln. You know, we're working on a project about Abraham Lincoln, and I said, I don't want to know, like, I already have these people. I want to know the person who just finished their dissertation on, you know, this area that I know happened in history, but I don't have any scholarship on it. And so those types of, you know, hey, I can give you this information, but, you know, talk to this person. Referrals are really, really helpful. The other thing is, you know, I think there's a lot of times where when approaching a scholar to say, hey, I need you for this thing. I'm going to take a lot of time out of your day. I'm going to put you in front of a camera. I'm going to probably ask you a bunch of questions. It's not an appealing ask. And I know, and so to say why you might say no, to really think on that, because I think sometimes I talk to somebody and it's like, well, this isn't really going to work because you're you're hyper focused on this angle, and that's something we might not be able to use for time or what have you. And just being very transparent about that in the conversation of why you might say no. Maybe it's timing. If it's timing and, you know, we have a production delay and I have an opportunity to come back to you, then I know that. If it's just like, I don't like you, then just say it's a hard no. I don't know. I think it's just like the idea of your, you know, you guys are, to me, scholars dedicating their lives to a topic. If I'm approaching to you to say, hey, come tell all of these people about what you know, you know,
in other words, please help me, right? Because sometimes you don't take the phone call and you need to take the phone call, right?
Right. And even if you can or don't want to do it, I'm sure there's somebody that you know that will.
Exactly. Sarah, Peter, either one of you want to speak to this? How did, you know?
Sure. So as someone with one foot in academic religious studies and one foot in more popular media and also public venues like the museum, I see my role often as a translator, someone who is able to assimilate the information that's happening with great nuance and complexity in the academy, whether it's among academic historians or scholars of religious studies, and then drawing out some of the narrative threads that are necessary to make it more accessible to a wider audience. And so a lot of that work can't happen, to continue with the translation metaphor, it can't happen unless there's the original text. And so if historians resist the idea of having their work translated, of having it brought to a different audience, it makes it much more difficult. So what I'd like to suggest to historians and to scholars generally is to understand that there is a value of their work that goes beyond their immediate audience. You are writing it for your colleagues, and you may be teaching it in your classroom, but there is a value to that work and to the insights and the discoveries you're making that is hugely relevant and important to a much larger audience. So engaging with those in the museum space or in popular media who are able to reach those larger audiences is a great benefit. I think it can be a career benefit because your name gets out there and that's great. But it's also just a benefit for the, you know, as the Smithsonian's motto is, for the increase in diffusion of knowledge. If that's what we're in this for, that is what we should all be doing together. And so finding ways to work together to find those stories and then translate them for wider audiences. I think that's ideally what the collaboration can look like.
Great, thank you.
And I would add that I feel like the thing that I think about with the American experience films that I've had the opportunity to work on, and I have a wonderful brief story about it, which is that I think in a way, history documentaries are kind of a wonderful gateway for students and for all ages to get interested in history and interested in subject matter. And I know for myself that if I know nothing about a subject, watching a documentary then makes reading a book that much, you know, that first book when you don't know anything about something, if you just know a little bit, and a documentary is just sort of this wonderful first pass. And just very quickly, I have a friend who teaches ESL in Boston, and she was working with women who were, you know, refugees. And she it happened to be teaching this class, and a woman came in and said, I want to do my report on Henry Ford. And
Wow.
my friend just looked at her and said, why Henry Ford? And she said, I turned on the television last night and I watched this documentary about Henry Ford. And so this is, a woman who's just learning English and just starting to become familiar with American culture and interested to then learn more and read more. So that was very exciting to me about what these films can do for people.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to ask you a question that I didn't ask you before, but I think it's really pertinent right now. There is a certain version of truth that happens in history, right? And all of you do history in different kinds of ways. And I want to just ask, what are the challenges of doing documentary history or museum work or the kinds of public work right now when we have people who have competing histories, and how we think about this? I'm right now, I'm thinking about the 1619 project versus the 1776 project, right? And you don't have to necessarily speak to that, but I'm just thinking about how do we deal with these different kinds of histories and doing public history? I think it's a crucial moment for that.
Sarah said it best. You want the people who know everything about, the people who are on this side of whatever spectrum to kind of hate it. And this side, like if somebody from each side of the spectrum has a complaint of some sort, not that it's inaccurate or whatever, but that the angle was a little too whatever, I think that's a good measure of if you're being kind of fair. One of the things that we tend to do is when we're working with a narrated project, our narration is kind of just moving us along.
Mm-hmm.
And the scholars that we pick are the important voices to have their approach. And we tell more than one scholar's approach so that we're not making any, we are obviously controlling the narrative and what the story arc is. We have our own thesis, but the contributors are taking you on that journey.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sarah, Peter, anyone you want to comment? I know this is a dangerous question.
Well, interestingly, in the museum space, particularly where you have, if you're describing an object in an exhibit, you have maybe 50 or 70 words. And I like to say that it's enough space to get everything wrong. It's not enough space to have much complexity and nuance. And so there's a tendency, there's an attraction to keeping it simple by avoiding things that are difficult to read or to include. And particularly with the subject of religion in a public history museum, you can see why one might want to do that. But interestingly, last year, we did a survey of museum visitors and their attitudes about religion and what they would hope to find if they were learning about religion in a National History Museum. And one of the things they really stressed was don't avoid the darker parts of history. Don't sidestep them. Don't try to act like it doesn't happen, because that just draws the legitimacy of the entire project into question. So I really took that to heart, so finding ways to do what you can within those 50 or 70 words, or through expanding it through exhibits on the web or through companion volumes, to tell those richer histories that don't avoid those parts of history that may make people uncomfortable just because it makes our jobs a little bit easier. So to really grapple with that complexity, I think, is an important part of the job.
Great. Thank you.
I would also say that, I learned from when I was learning how to make films from my mentor in filmmaking, who said he was always thinking of the audience as a smart 7th grader. So you're thinking about making it really clear. It's not simple, but it's accessible. And then that you can have layers and layers of complexity so that you can come to the piece, come to a history film knowing nothing, or you can come knowing a lot, but finding something there. So I think that's helpful for us when we're working on this kind of work, which is to think of the audience as very broad, but also, smart and inquisitive, but not necessarily sophisticated beyond kind of middle school, because then you can really, that's a good measure as the filmmaker to make sure that you're doing your job. If you're always thinking about, okay, how is that 7th grader going to understand this? You know, do they know who Martin Luther King is? You know, do they every time you introduce somebody new, it's like, how are you going to introduce them? And then, you know, go from there.
Great. I'm going to jump to some of the Q&A. So if anybody else has any questions, we'll do that because I want to watch time. And then I'll have one last question for all of you at the end. But this question is for Veronica. How did you avoid or take advantage of the popular expectations laid down by Dan Brown's books where these are concerned?
It was actually more of a concern for the people we were approaching than anything else, because no one wanted us to tell those stories within the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
So for us, it was, you know, kind of an easy sidestep, because we weren't telling the same, like we weren't telling these origin stories for very long. We went through 1,000 years in one episode. Yeah. So we just kind of like gave, like Sarah said, that basic knowledge, right? Like, here's what we're talking about. Here's the institutions here. Like, we literally had little, you know, hats for bishops in the Holy Roman Empire, and it was like very rudimentary. And then we went into the more kind of larger theme of our piece, which was, who is this man? And do you realize he's touched literally almost everything, every major event you've ever thought about in history? And that's where we came in to talk about more, you know, obviously Catholicism as a practice, is a lot of education. It was very helpful for me, raised Catholic, to work with, you know, Jewish colleagues. It was because, you know, things you kind of take for granted as like, oh yeah, this. They're like, the what? You know. Mm-hmm. So anyway, but that process was able for us to have a different expectation from people.
Okay, great. I'm going to put this question to everyone that came in the chat, and I think this is really important for everybody that's watching right now. How does an academic historian successfully pitch an idea to make a biography into a film? Or maybe a museum exhibit? Or if there's a pitch at all, how does it happen?
I mean, Sarah, I feel like you're on the edge of answering, and I'm on the edge of answering.
You go ahead, Veronica.
So I get approached, you know, for a series about, or a special about, you know, this figure. It's I would say come with an open mind, I think, because, and come and who you're going to pitch it to, do your research on what they've worked on, what their style is, if you think you'll mesh, but also understand that, you know, whether it's the figure itself will be the vehicle for where the distribution goes. And so, you know, if you want to put a certain type of character on CNN, or if you want to put a certain type of character on PBS, you know, they'll have some things together. But if you want to go to the History Channel, it's gonna, your expectations should be different. And I think that's kind of like, do your homework on what things are happening and be open to what that pitch can become.
And I just add to that, which is that you know, and maybe this is I don't want to sound discouraging, but the you know, what goes into raising the money and making these things happen, it's years and years. So you have to be really, you know, prepared to take a lot of no's and a lot of disappointments. I say that as someone who has to do that all as a filmmaker. So it is, these are hard things to get made. And so it just, even the best projects or the easiest projects that happen, they still take years to happen. So that would just be, and that's not hopefully sounding too pessimistic, but it's just sort of being realistic.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's a lot of money. Peter, this question is directly towards you. 20 some years ago, the Library of Congress had its Religion and Founding of American Republic exhibit. Was there anything that was learned from that project? What was effective or less so, or were there conversations with people who were involved? Maybe the bigger question is whether or how these types of projects build on previous work.
That's a great question. Thank you. And that of course was long before my time at the Smithsonian, but I did research that exhibit as we were developing Religion in Early America. The most significant difference, well, a couple of significant differences. First of all, because that exhibit was based at the Library of Congress, it was largely a document-based exhibit. There are, of course, many, many significant documents related to religion and American history, but we were going for something very different. We were looking for active objects to complement some of those significant documents we had. So objects that showed religion as it's lived. So for example, we have the compass that Roger Williams used as he was exiled from Massachusetts and explored Rhode Island, looking for a place to found his own colony. We had the saddlebags used by a Methodist itinerant preacher. We had, for that matter, George Whitfield's portable traveling pulpit that he would fold down and strap on the side of his horse to put out in a field so he could preach to the crowds of the Great Awakening. So we really wanted to open up the exhibit with those types of objects that you could imagine in people's lives. So over the course of decades, telling these stories in public spaces, a lot has been learned, and it has to do in part with what types of audiences we're trying to engage, and trying to engage the largely school-age audiences that come to the National Museum of American History. You really need something that students who are there feel like they can hold or they can climb up on, even if, of course, we don't let them do that.
Yeah, exactly. Or don't let some little child preacher preach from that pulpit, right? This is going to be a question that I'm going to direct to those of you who are filming. What tips do you all have for scholars to get the attention of media producers, documentary producers who are looking for expert contributors? In other words, how am I discovered? How do you find who you find, besides somebody like me telling you, go talk to that person?
I mean, I hate to say it, I think it's a combination of things. It's, of course, publishing, because that's sort of the first place you start with any project, is reading books and also watching other documentaries. So it's sort of, if you've been in one, it often can lead to another. But I also think that it is word of mouth. It's all about, talking to scholars who then recommend other scholars. I mean, every single conversation I have at the beginning of a project is, who else do you think I should be talking to? And you always know that you've finally gotten to a good place with your research when everyone is recommending people you've already heard you should talk to. So then you feel like, okay, I've now sort of gotten my list down to the right group of people that are the experts on this subject.
Yeah, I think that's good. Peter, I want to tag off of that and sort of follow up and ask you a question and say, how do you figure out where to go for the things that you need to find? And I think that's, you had, something that was really big with the Church of Latter-day Saints, because you had a very big place. But I know for a lot of, African-American resources, you just don't have an archive to go to. Like, how do you start to think about, how do you procure things?
You read very widely and see what's out there. And you also, your question gets to a really good point about the types of stories that we can tell with material culture, because the assumption that we have all the materials we need to tell the important stories assumes a lot about what the important stories are, because very often those communities that are able to save their material and pass it on generation to generation and to have archives, those are the communities with a certain amount of power. And to find ways to tell the stories of those who don't have that type of power is a real challenge, particularly in an exhibit like this. And often to try to work through that, you search far and wide, and you turn over every rock and look for whatever you can find. And that was a real important part of this exhibit, was not only telling those stories that you would expect. There's a saying that goes around the museum of, you give the people what they want, so you can also give them what they need. Mm-hmm. And that was the approach that we had in this exhibit. So you saw, for example, in that short clip that we included an object from the museum collection of George Washington's christening robe, the type of object that someone might expect to see in a Religion in Early America exhibit at the National Museum of American History. But you didn't see in that clip is that right next to it we included the Balali document, which is one of the only known manuscripts written by an enslaved Muslim in America. So if someone comes to the exhibit and wants to see George Washington's christening robe, whether they know it or not, they're going to come away learning about Muslims in early America, about Islam and slavery, and they'll come away understanding that both of those pieces are part of American religious history.
Yeah, thank you. Sarah, these two are for you, and I'm going to collapse them into one. The first question is there any plans for a follow-up to God in America? And then the other question is about the Billy Graham story has complexity. How does his son Franklin add to that complexity, given that he tries to control the narrative about his father? And I think that's actually a good question about what you have to do for the archives, because those things changed hands, and that was an interesting story.
Well, I'll start with the God in America question. It's so nice I saw that question. It's so nice to hear that people are using that series in their in classes and stuff. You know, that was a really challenging series. And I feel proud of what I did on that project, but it feels like it was hard and painful, and it's just nice to know it still has a life out in the world. I don't know if there would be anything more, but it would really come from WGBH in Boston, because that was a special series that they put years and years of work in to make it happen. So that would be a good question for the WGBH kind of programming people. So I don't have any good news on that. In terms of getting access, so one of the most important things, and Veronica touched on this when she was talking about her clip, is, for us, is that we need to be able to talk with scholars and have interviews, but we also need, very, very importantly, visual material. And so the best stories, the ones that I've had the most fun with, are the ones with a very big archival collection. And certainly the Billy Graham story is just a fantastic one, because he was such a public figure. So that helps you so much as a filmmaker. And I would say that in terms of this project, we've been incredibly pleased and grateful to have access to the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association archive. And just as we did with the Walt Disney film for American Experience, right up front, right at the beginning, in the negotiation of can we have access, we always make it very clear that we have a very clear mandate, which is there is absolutely no editorial control except for with American Experience and WGBH. And so the only way we can have access is if people know that. And so there is no controlling of the narrative. And so if they want to give us access, they have to agree to that. We were able to get the people at Walt Disney to do that for us, which was a huge endeavor, thing, very big deal. And we've been able to, so far, that has been the deal. That's what's happening with the Billy Graham documentary.
Okay. I've got a question that's actually a really good question, but I'm going to rephrase it a little bit. So the person who asked this question, why I'm rephrasing it. We've been talking about this on a large scale, but there's so many small scale things, and not to say that they're small, but they're local and regional kinds of ways that you can reach the public through museums or through small documentaries and things like that. Could you say anything about that kind of work, and any advice for historians or scholars or, independent scholars who might be out here that want to do that kind of work and to think about that? Because I think, thinking about the dawning idea about how much money it would take to make this American Experience, or the money that you got from Lily, Peter, or the kinds of money that you get Veronica to do the series on CNN, not everybody's going to have that, but there are lots of little regional stories that could be told. And I think with, things like YouTube and everything else, there's ways in which you could do that. So any advice you have for people that want to do those kinds of things?
Yeah, actually, I have done a number of collaborations with on the more local level with the Pennsylvania Historical Society, with a house, Cliveden in Germantown, where there are grants that you can get enough money to do some sort of kind of installation thing, a video, something that's public programming that also leads to a piece of media. And it's very accessible. I've worked with a Pew grant on that. We've worked with federal money that you know, if you're a historian and you want to engage in this project, there are producers and media makers that are accessible, affordable, and the term is a lot shorter. And, you know, you have to think about how to make that programming interactive, but it is a thing that happens for sure.
Mhm. And I'm going to make a little plug right here because somebody put this in the chat. And thank you, Daniel Sack. People working on local regional stories should talk with their state's humanities councils, and the NEH offers grants for short documentaries. So be aware of that as well. Peter or Sarah, you want to say anything about that before I take these last two?
Sure, I'll just add that I know conversations with folks who teach, particularly religious studies focused in a regional way, that they've had a lot of success working with podcasting and having their students go out and do audio recording and making that a part of their academic work. And that becomes really generative for scholars themselves to be out there collecting new material, but also a great pedagogical tool as well. So exploring those new technologies, which have never been easier to use, making use of students who want to engage with material in that way, I think is a really beneficial way of approaching this in a regional way.
Okay. I'm going to combine a couple of questions because we're kind of coming to the end. So I want to just put these out here. This is two-part, and I think we kind of answered this one first, but how do you try to cover topics that cover the moment, but not necessarily get caught up in today's politics, you know, so you can give space to the past? And then what are your concerns about dumbing it down? In other words, how far do you go before it's like, I'm not going that far anymore?
I mean, I would say the question about kind of the politics, I think the key thing that I've always been sort of taught in making history films is that you don't need to make connections for people except to tell a really good story. And it becomes very obvious that the past and the present are so deeply connected. And I remember the first history film I ever worked on for American Experience. I was doing photo research and found footage or photographs of Filipino huts being burned by American soldiers. And I couldn't, you know, that was really remarkable to me because I thought that was something we started in, you know, Vietnam. I didn't, you know what I mean? And so you didn't have to say anything about later wars. You could just show those photographs and recognize how history repeats itself. And these things are happening over and over again, and they're relevant to today.
Yeah, and sprinkling context is important, right? You want people to relate to this history content, to say like, oh, I didn't imagine that was what was going on then. It's just like today. But you want to contextualize it in some way, and so, you know, we just did a 6-part series that'll be airing on a president. Obviously, it was a very presidential time, a presidential newsworthy time for us, and it still is. And so we did a lot of asking questions that, it's like you said, we don't have to be explicit about what is happening right now. And it's just, hey, are you thinking this? You are. Look, this is a similar situation.
I think there's something to be said for not treating something as controversial simply because it's not common knowledge. And so in the Religion in Early America exhibit, for example, we were presenting it at a time of heightened Islamophobia across media and across America. It's not controversial that Muslims are part of the early American experience. And so just to present it in the exhibit as a fact and not as something that was a matter of interpretation, I think made a statement. It did not court controversy. It just simply tried to rewrite something into the historical record that is not controversial at all. So to present something as true, something that is true as true, and not to pretend that there are two different versions of history very often. Very often there are attempts of rewriting history, and there are attempts, and we need to meet those with the attempt to simply tell it as it was.
And then I'm going to save one question for last because I'll mix it with mine. But finally, if you're going to think about pitching a story, how do you think, or I'll ask this a different way, either in pitching or in bringing stories that are people who get marginalized, or stories that get marginalized from the normal kind of narrative of American history. How do you think about those stories, whether you show them in the museum or you show them on television? How do you think about those stories? And what, we've talked about some really big people today, in other words, Billy Graham or Lincoln or a Pope or, American religion. How do we bring those stories that people don't hear, those stories from the margins, into the center so that people can start to see that there's a broader history?
I mean, from my experience and what I would say and my plug is that we need to get more people into positions of power who think differently. I'm sitting here as someone who has had these amazing opportunities to make, stories that I'm very excited about. But I will be honest that I did not become a documentary filmmaker to make films about white male industrialists, that wasn't what I don't want to sound ungrateful, and I've loved all the work that I've done, but I'd love to tell more women's stories. I'd love to tell stories that are fresher and different ways of thinking about history. And that just aren't the films that I've been commissioned to make. And so I think this is about a change from sort of everywhere. Anyway, that would be my plug for that, or how I would answer that.
Okay.
Yeah, I second that. I didn't expect to see myself telling the stories that I've told. And, there's a lot of resistance to what people use the term market research. It's really, it's not research at all. It's a very gatekeeper situation where, this is what people will watch because I say so, at the very tippy top. And so, it is a challenge, and there's no sugarcoating that it is difficult to get the funds or get the clearance or get the green light to tell those stories. One way that, when we're talking about a figure that's so huge, instead of coming from the top down and looking at look at his impact on the world, it's who did he impact and what are their stories. And so when you can do that, you're kind of flipping, even though you are telling his story, you're flipping the point of view. And so the more we flip the point of view, the more people realize it resonates, and people being the money holders resonates. Also, I just truly believe that a powerful story will get somewhere, some point, if it's a good story and it's strong and it's somebody who can walk into a room who has, Sarah's body of work and says, I'm telling you, this is going to be a good story, doing it. It sounds idealistic, it is, but it's how things change.
Yeah. Peter?
Well, I think in the museum space, this has to do with something I mentioned earlier, with the stories that are privileged by the objects that remain. And just deciding from this starting point that even if you have the best possible objects from a story that has already been told, don't use those. Find a way to tell the story about the people whose objects you don't have. Find a way to relate and explain, to contextualize that absence, and make clear that tells a story as well. So working against some of the constraints of the medium, I think you often find yourself doing, and it's a way to ensure that you will pay attention to other stories and not just tell the stories which are easiest to tell.
Great. So I have one final question. I'm going to melt it in with somebody else's question. So imagine that you have all the money that you want. Some great benefactor gives you everything you want. What is the story you've been chasing for a while that you've always wanted to tell? Or Ahab's white whale. What's that story? And how would you do it? And a little bit of time, not a lot. There's got to be somebody out there.
I mean, I would say that, I've been thinking about that. I saw that question and I have a film that I've been talking about making since 2011, and I haven't made it yet. And it's about, it's not, I think the way I would characterize it is that there are stories about very regular people coming together, doing extraordinary things, which I'm interested in. So stories that are smaller stories, where you can tell something very complex and nuanced and passionate and emotional, but they're just about kind of bus drivers and garbage men and, people that nobody ever tells stories about. That's the kind of story I'm interested, maybe someday I'll get to make.
Yeah.
I have the same exact desire. And I've started to research it and get into it because I met a senator, former senator in Louisiana on a project I'm doing right now that has nothing to do with history. And he and I were chatting and he said, I was the first African-American to read in the all-white library here. And, his story, his individual story is so many people's stories.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. There's a collection of stories of, like you said, you hear about Rosa Parks, but that story is complex, but there are a lot more people who just said, I'm not moving, take it to the courts and we will win. And that's the kind of bravery the stories I want to tell.
Yeah. Peter, what's your museum get?
Well, I think along a couple tracks. My work at the museum is undergirded by my research several years ago in a book I published called One Nation Under Gods, which tried to be my big narrative history of non-Christian religious influences on American history. And so as far as I've tried to have a big picture view of American history as it relates to religion and religious difference, that's the type of vision I have brought with me to the museum. So finding a way to translate that into the museum space is a long-term, it is a career project that may influence one exhibit, it may influence many exhibits. But of course, I'm also engaged as a curator in collecting the objects of today. So I'm always on the lookout for those objects that seem to glow with significance as soon as you see them. And you think future generations will need to consider that object to make sense of who we are. And so I have a long list of objects that those might be. But the one that's most on my radar right now is what might be called as the Jefferson Bible is called the Jefferson Bible, the book that might one day be called the Trump Bible, which is of course the Bible that he held as he cleared Lafayette Square. I don't know where that Bible is or who owns it now, but it's an important part of telling the story of American religion right now. And I would love to know where it landed.
Well, if you get that Bible, you need to get the handbag that goes along with the Bible. So you have to have both together because it doesn't work without the handbag that he pulled you get that Bible out of, right? And on that note, please join me in thanking Sarah Colt, Veronica Stickelman, and Peter Manceau for this great conversation tonight. I think this was lovely. And just thank you all for really giving us a sense of the work that you do, how important it is for public scholarship, and how we can all be involved. So I want to thank you on the behalf of American Society of Church History for doing this for us this evening. And thank you all for joining us out there in the world. We will see you all day tomorrow starting at 9:30 in the morning Eastern Standard Time. Please go and look at the Church History website. And if you got a link, if you paid your membership, do so. If you didn't, pay it tonight so you can join us all day tomorrow. Okay, thanks a lot and have a great night.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Good night.